whole European Union.
They don't test. They don't test like we test.
Is it possible that they don't have the virus as badly as we do?
No, it's possible that they don't test. That's what's possible. We find cases, and many of those cases heal automatically. We're finding, in a way, we're creating trouble.
A lot of people say this is because we don't have a national plan. You talk about states. We don't have a national plan. Do you take responsibility for that?
Look, I take responsibility always for everything because it's ultimately my job too. I have to get everybody in line. Some governors have done well, some governors have done poorly. But we have more tests by far than any country in the world.
But sir, testing is up 37%.
Well, that's good.
I understand. Cases are up 194%. It isn't just that testing has gone up, it's that the virus has spread. The positivity rate has increased.
Many
the
of
virus
those
is
cases,
worse than it was.
Many of those cases are young people that would heal in a day. They have the sniffles, and we put it down as a test. The coronavirus, I think that at some point that's going to sort of just disappear, I hope. I'll be right eventually. Say this.
Okay, so we need to talk about what just happened in the Supreme Court. Because this wasn't just another legal hearing. This wasn't just lawyers arguing about tariffs and trade policy. This was Donald Trump getting absolutely destroyed by the highest court in the land and then losing his mind about it right there in the courtroom in front of everyone. November 5th, 2025, a date that's going to be talked about for years because what went down in that Supreme Court chamber was unlike anything we've seen in modern American politics. Trump sat there and watched as justice after justice tore apart his legal arguments. And then, according to multiple reports, he completely lost it. We're talking yelling. We're talking banging papers on the table. We're talking about a former president daring the Supreme Court to convict him. Yeah, you heard that right. Convict him in a civil case about tariffs. That's where we are right now. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
That's a lot of money.
And you're going to take them, you know where the money goes? It goes overwhelmingly to disadvantaged kids and children with disabilities.
Let the schools...
Why wouldn't you send more money so the schools would be safer?
Let the schools open.
And will you consider a national mandate that people need to wear masks?
No, I want people to have a certain freedom, and I don't believe in that, no. And I don't agree with the statement that if everybody wear a mask, everything disappears.
Is the Confederate flag offensive?
It depends on who you're talking about, when you're talking about. When people proudly had their Confederate flags, they're not talking about racism. They love their flag. It represents the South. It's freedom of speech.
So you're not offended by it?
Well, I'm not offended either by Black Lives Matter. That's freedom of speech. And you know, the whole thing with cancel culture, we can't cancel our whole...
Let me set the scene for you. The Supreme Court is hearing arguments about Trump's use of emergency powers to impose tariffs on basically the entire world. $90 billion worth of tariffs. No congressional approval, no debate, just Trump deciding that he could tax American businesses and consumers because he called it a national emergency. And the justices, including the ones Trump himself appointed, are not buying it. Chief Justice John Roberts looks at Trump's lawyer and says something that should make everyone pay attention. He says, "You're claiming the authority to impose tariffs on any product from any country with no checks. That's a major authority, and that's not what the law was meant to allow." Let that sink in for a second. The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court is basically telling Trump, yeah, you went too far, buddy. You don't get to do whatever you want just because you're president. But it gets better. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who Trump put on the court himself, remember, she starts asking these pointed questions. Has Congress really handed over the power to set tariffs on a whim? She's not even trying to be subtle about it. She's asking if Trump basically gave himself unlimited power over trade policy. And Trump's lawyers, they're stumbling. They're stammering. They can't give a straight answer. Because the truth is, they know this is indefensible. They know Trump overstepped, but they have to stand there and defend it anyway, because that's their job. And Trump is sitting right there watching this happen, watching his own appointees question whether he abused his power. You can imagine how well that went over. The day before this hearing, Trump posts on Truth Social, in all caps, because of course he does, saying this Supreme Court case is literally life or death for our country. Life or death, not just important, not just significant, but life or death. That's the kind of dramatic language Trump uses when he knows he's in trouble, when he knows he's about to take a loss and needs to fire up his base before it happens. He's setting the stage. He's creating the narrative that if he loses, it's because the system is rigged against him. Classic Trump playbook. But here's the thing, you can't rig the Supreme Court when you appointed a third of it. So what's the excuse going to be this time? And then the hearing happens, and according to people who were in that courtroom, Trump could not keep it together. Legal observers and media outlets are reporting that Trump lost his composure, that he yelled at justices, that he banged papers on the table, that he actually dared the court to convict him in a case that isn't even a criminal trial, in a case where conviction isn't even on the table. But Trump is so used to framing everything as him being persecuted, him being attacked, him being the victim, that he can't help himself. Even when the Supreme Court is just doing its job and asking basic constitutional questions, Trump sees it as a personal attack. There were apparently threats of contempt, discussions about whether Trump needed to be removed from the courtroom. This is the former president of the United States we're talking about, and he's acting like this in the Supreme Court. So why does this matter? Why should you care about Trump having a meltdown in court? Because this isn't just about his temperament, though that's obviously an issue. This is about the fundamental question of presidential power. This is about whether we live in a country where the president can bypass Congress and impose massive taxes on Americans just by declaring an emergency. This is about whether the Supreme Court is going to put limits on executive authority or whether they're going to let Trump and every future president run wild with emergency powers. The justices seem skeptical. Multiple news outlets are reporting that they signal doubts over Trump's sweeping tariff powers. CBS News said the justices seem skeptical of Trump's authority. CNN talked about how rocky the arguments were for Trump's side. France 24 reported that the Supreme Court is signaling serious doubts. This is not looking good for Trump, and he knows it. That's why he melted down. But here's what makes this even more significant. We're heading into the 2026 midterms. Republicans are trying to figure out their strategy. Trump is still the dominant force in the party. And now we have this moment where Trump lost control in the Supreme Court, where he got publicly rebuked by justices, including his own appointees, for abusing presidential power. Democrats are going to run with this. They're going to say, see, even his own Supreme Court thinks he went too far. Even the justices he picked think he's dangerous. How do Republicans respond to that? Do they defend Trump's behavior? Do they distance themselves? Either way, it's a nightmare scenario. And the video clips, the reports, the transcripts, they're all going to be used in campaign ads for the next year and a half. Trump just handed his opponents a gift, and he did it by losing his temper in the one place where losing your temper makes you look completely unhinged. Okay, let's break down what actually happened during these arguments, because the details are wild. So here's what you need to understand about this case. Trump didn't just impose some tariffs and call it a day. He used something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to basically rewrite American trade policy by himself. No input from Congress, no debate, no vote, just an executive order. He declared that unfair trade practices were a national security emergency, which, come on, is a stretch, and then used that declaration to impose tariffs on countries all over the world: China, Europe, Canada, Mexico, everybody. $90 billion worth of tariffs. That's not pocket change. That's a massive amount of money that American businesses had to pay, and those businesses passed those costs on to consumers. So really, Trump imposed a $90 billion tax on Americans without Congress approving it. Let me say that again. Trump taxed Americans without congressional approval. That's what this case is really about. The Constitution is pretty clear on this stuff. Congress has the power to tax. Congress has the power to regulate commerce. That's in Article 1, right at the beginning. The founders set it up that way on purpose because they just fought a war against a king who could impose taxes by decree. They didn't want an American president who could do the same thing. But over the years, Congress has passed laws giving the president some emergency powers, and those laws make sense for real emergencies. If there's a war or a terrorist attack or something genuinely catastrophic, you need the president to be able to act quickly. You can't wait for Congress to spend 6 months debating. But the key word there is emergency. Real emergency. Not just Trump deciding that trade deficits are an emergency because it helps his political narrative. And that's what the Supreme Court is wrestling with. Did Trump actually have the authority to do this? Or did he just grab power that wasn't his to grab? Chief Justice Roberts really went after Trump's legal team on this. He kept pushing them on the scope of what they're claiming. He said, you're claiming the authority to impose tariffs on any product from any country with no checks. That's a major authority, and that's not what the law was meant to allow. Think about what Roberts is saying there. He's pointing out that Trump is claiming essentially unlimited power over trade, any product, any country, no checks, no balances, just Trump deciding what gets taxed and what doesn't. And Roberts is saying, yeah, that's not how this is supposed to work. That's not what Congress intended when they passed the emergency powers law. Trump is twisting the law to give himself powers he was never meant to have, and the Chief Justice is calling him out on it directly. Justice Barrett's questions were particularly damaging because, again, Trump appointed her. She's supposed to be on his side, but she's asking, has Congress really handed over the power to set tariffs on a whim? She's questioning the entire legal foundation of Trump's argument. She's asking if Congress actually gave the president the authority to just impose tariffs whenever he feels like it, for whatever reason he decides is an emergency. And the answer, if you actually read the law and the legislative history, is no. Congress did not give the president that power. They gave the president narrow emergency powers for specific situations. But Trump took those narrow powers and stretched them as far as they would go. And now the Supreme Court is asking if he stretched them too far. Based on the questions from the justices, it seems pretty clear they think he did. But let's talk about what happened with Trump himself during this hearing, because this is where things went completely off the rails. Multiple sources are reporting that Trump lost his composure in the courtroom. He wasn't just sitting there quietly listening to the arguments like you're supposed to do. He was reacting, he was getting agitated, and then apparently he started yelling at Supreme Court justices. Let that sink in. A former president yelling at the Supreme Court. Reports say he was banging papers on the table, making a scene, and then, and this is the part that's just absolutely bizarre, he supposedly dared the court to convict him in a case that has nothing to do with criminal conviction, in a case about whether his tariffs were legal. But Trump is so deep in his persecution complex, so convinced that everything is a witch hunt against him, that he's talking about being convicted when that's not even what this case is about. Legal observers who were in the courtroom said there were discussions about contempt, about whether Trump needed to be warned or even removed. The Supreme Court doesn't mess around with decorum. This isn't a rally. This isn't a press conference. You can't just act however you want in the Supreme Court. There are rules, there's protocol, and Trump apparently couldn't follow those rules. He couldn't sit there and let his lawyers do their job. He had to make it about him. He had to create drama, and in doing so, he made himself look completely out of control, which, by the way, is exactly what his opponents have been saying about him for years, that he's temperamentally unfit for office, that he can't control himself, that he's dangerous, and Trump just proved their point for them in the Supreme Court, on the record, with witnesses everywhere. The justices, according to CBS News, seem skeptical of Trump's authority. CNN described the arguments as rocky for Trump's side. France 24 said the court is signaling doubts over Trump's sweeping tariff powers. This is coming from multiple outlets across the political spectrum. This isn't partisan spin. This is just reporting on what happened. The justices asked hard questions. Trump's lawyers couldn't answer them convincingly, and Trump himself melted down in the process. It's a disaster for him legally and politically. Legally, because it looks like he's going to lose this case. The justices are telegraphing their skepticism pretty clearly. And if Trump loses, those tariffs get rolled back. $90 billion potentially gets refunded to businesses. Trump's signature trade policy gets struck down as illegal. That's a huge blow to his credibility and his claims about being a strong leader who gets things done. Politically, it's even worse, because now Democrats have ammunition for the midterms. They can run ads showing Trump losing his temper in the Supreme Court. They can quote Chief Justice Roberts saying Trump claimed authority he wasn't meant to have. They can point to Justice Barrett, Trump's own appointee, questioning whether he abused his power. And they can tie it all together into a narrative about Trump being dangerous, unstable, and willing to violate the Constitution to get what he wants. Republicans are going to have a really hard time defending this. Some of them are already trying to distance themselves. They're saying things like, well, I support tough trade policies, but maybe the legal approach was flawed. That's code for Trump screwed this up, and I don't want to go down with him. And the timing couldn't be worse for Trump. The 2026 midterms are coming. Republicans need to figure out their message, and now they have to deal with the Supreme Court disaster hanging over everything. Do they stick with Trump? Do they defend his behavior? Or do they try to move past him and focus on other issues? Either way, it's messy. Trump still has a stranglehold on the Republican base, but moments like this, where he loses control in public, where he gets rebuked by his own appointees, where he looks weak and desperate, those moments chip away at his image. They make it harder for Republicans to argue that Trump is the strong leader America needs, because strong leaders don't melt down in the Supreme Court. Strong leaders don't yell at judges. Strong leaders don't dare the court to convict them in civil cases. Trump did all of those things, and it's going to cost him. The broader issue here is about presidential power, and that's what makes this case so important, beyond just Trump's personal drama. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump, which seems likely based on the oral arguments, they'll be setting a precedent that limits what future presidents can do with emergency powers. They'll be drawing a line and saying, no, you can't just declare an emergency and bypass Congress to impose taxes on Americans. You can't just grab power that the Constitution gives to the legislative branch. That's a big deal, because presidential power has been expanding for decades. Every president pushes a little further than the last one, and at some point, somebody has to say stop. it looks like the Supreme Court might be saying stop right now, with Trump as the example of what happens when a president goes too far. That's going to shape American government for years to come. Long after Trump is gone, this case will be cited as the moment when the Supreme Court put limits on emergency powers, when they checked an out-of-control executive branch, when they reminded everyone that we still have 3 branches of government and they're supposed to balance each other out. Okay, so what does all of this actually mean going forward? Let's break it down. Here's the bottom line. This Supreme Court case is going to have massive implications, no matter how it turns out. But based on what we saw during oral arguments, it looks like Trump is going to lose. And when he loses, it's going to reshape both his political future and the powers of the presidency itself. Let's break this down into the key points so you understand what's really at stake here. First, the constitutional issue. What Trump did with these tariffs is basically the president writing laws. He didn't enforce a law that Congress passed. He created a new tax policy and then enforced it himself. That's combining 2 of the 3 branches of government into one person. The founders specifically designed the system to prevent exactly this kind of thing. They wanted separation of powers. They wanted checks and balances. They wanted to make sure no one person could accumulate too much authority. But Trump looked at that system and said, yeah, I'm just going to do this anyway. I'm going to call it an emergency and use that as justification to bypass Congress entirely. And for a while, it worked. The tariffs went into effect. American businesses paid $90 billion. Prices went up for consumers. Trump got to claim a win on trade policy and tell his supporters he was being tough on China and protecting American workers. But now the bill is coming due. Now the Supreme Court is asking whether any of this was actually legal. And from the questions the justices asked, it's pretty clear they don't think it was. Chief Justice Roberts pointing out that Trump is claiming unlimited authority with no checks. Justice Barrett asking if Congress really handed over the power to set tariffs on a whim. These aren't friendly questions. These are justices who see a constitutional problem and are trying to figure out how to fix it. When the court rules, probably sometime in spring or early summer of 2026, they're likely going to say that Trump exceeded his authority, that he abused emergency powers, that presidents can't just bypass Congress like this, and that decision is going to create a precedent that limits executive power for decades. Second, the political fallout. Trump's outburst in the courtroom is going to follow him everywhere. There's apparently video, there are transcripts, there are witness accounts from legal observers and journalists who were there. Democrats are going to use all of it. They're going to run ads showing Trump losing control. They're going to quote the justices saying he claimed powers he wasn't meant to have. They're going to argue that Trump is temperamentally unfit to hold office again. And Republicans are going to struggle to respond. How do you defend a guy who yelled at Supreme Court justices? How do you defend someone who dared the court to convict him in a case that has nothing to do with criminal charges? You can't. Not really. So Republicans are going to try to change the subject. They're going to talk about the economy or immigration or whatever else they think will work. But this Supreme Court disaster is going to keep coming back. It's going to be a defining moment of Trump's post-presidency, right up there with the other legal troubles he's had. And here's the thing about timing. The 2026 midterms are crucial. Republicans want to take back full control of Congress. Trump wants to be the kingmaker who decides which candidates succeed. But if he's seen as a liability, if he's the guy who melted down in the Supreme Court and got his signature policy struck down as illegal, then his endorsement starts to matter less. Republican candidates in swing districts might start distancing themselves from him. They might decide it's safer to run their own campaigns without Trump's baggage. That would be a huge shift in Republican politics. Trump has been the dominant force in the party since 2016, but moments like this Supreme Court disaster could start to change that calculus, especially if Republicans lose seats in 2026 and blame it on Trump dragging them down. Third, the economic consequences. If the Supreme Court strikes down Trump's tariffs, that $90 billion becomes a huge question mark. Do businesses get refunds? If so, where does that money come from? The government already spent it, so either they have to cut other programs, or they have to increase the deficit, or they have to raise taxes somewhere else. None of those options are great. And what about the businesses that already passed the cost on to consumers? What about the price increases that already happened? You can't just undo all of that. The economy has already adjusted to Trump's tariffs. Supply chains have changed. Business models have shifted. And now we're potentially going to unwind all of it. That's going to create chaos. Justice Barrett was asking about this during oral arguments. She wanted to know how the practical side of this works. And Trump's lawyers couldn't give her a good answer because there isn't one. This is going to be messy no matter what happens. Fourth, what this means for future presidents. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump, they're going to set boundaries on emergency powers. Future presidents will know they can't just declare an emergency for political reasons and use it to bypass Congress. There will be limits, real limits enforced by the Supreme Court. And honestly, That's probably a good thing regardless of your politics, because you might like it when your God does it, but what about when the other side wins? Do you really want a Democratic president declaring climate change an emergency and using it to impose massive regulations without congressional approval? Do you really want any president having that kind of unchecked power? The whole point of the American system is that power is limited and distributed. No one person should be able to make decisions this big on their own. The Supreme Court seems to understand that, and they're about to remind Trump and every future president that there are still rules. But let's talk about what happens if Trump somehow wins this case. If the Supreme Court backs him up and says, yeah, the president can do this, then we've just fundamentally changed American government. We've said that emergency powers can be stretched to cover basically anything. Trade deficits are an emergency. Maybe climate change is an emergency. Maybe gun violence is an emergency. Maybe healthcare costs are an emergency. Once you open that door, every president is going to walk through it. They're going to declare emergencies for their pet issues and bypass Congress whenever it's convenient. The legislative branch becomes irrelevant. All the power flows to the White House. That should terrify everyone, not just because of Trump, but because of what it means for the system, for democracy, for the balance of power that's kept America stable for over 200 years. The Supreme Court hearing on November 5th was just the beginning of this process. The justices will spend months deliberating, they'll write opinions, they'll argue among themselves about the legal reasoning, and then they'll release their decision, and half the country will be furious no matter what they decide. If they rule against Trump, his supporters will say the court is biased and rigged and part of the deep state conspiracy. If they rule for Trump, his opponents will say the court just handed unlimited power to the presidency and destroyed the Constitution. There's no middle ground here, no way to make everyone happy. The Supreme Court is going to have to make a choice about what kind of country we are, whether we still have meaningful separation of powers or whether we've moved into something different, something where the president can essentially legislate from the Oval Office as long as they call it an emergency first. And through all of this, Trump is going to keep being Trump. He's going to keep attacking the court on social media. He's going to keep claiming persecution. He's going to keep telling his supporters that the system is rigged against him. But here's the reality. The system isn't rigged. The Supreme Court is doing its job. They're asking constitutional questions that need to be asked. They're checking executive power like they're supposed to. And if Trump can't handle that, if he melts down in the courtroom and yells at justices and bangs papers on the table, then that says more about him than it does about the system. It says he's not fit for the office he used to hold. It says he can't control himself, even in the most important legal settings. It says he's exactly what his critics have been saying all along: temperamentally unfit, dangerously impulsive, willing to break norms and rules to get what he wants. That's the real story here. Not just the legal case about tariffs, not just the constitutional questions about emergency powers, but the fundamental question of whether Donald Trump should ever hold power again. And based on what happened in the Supreme Court on November 5th, the answer seems pretty clear. This is a guy who can't even sit quietly during oral arguments without causing a scene. This is a guy who thinks Supreme Court justices are his enemies just because they're asking tough questions. This is a guy who claimed powers no other president has ever claimed and then threw a tantrum when he got called out for it. Does that sound like someone who should be president? Does that sound like someone who respects the Constitution and the rule of law? Or does that sound like someone who thinks he's above all of it? You can decide for yourself, but the Supreme Court seems to have already made up its mind. And come spring of 2026, we're going to see just how far they're willing to go to put limits on Trump's abuse of power.